The last liquidation auction in Iron Hollow felt like a wake, where everyone pretended it was a business meeting. The Monarch Mine's headframe stood up the slope like a snapped rib, and the men in the yard talked around their losses the way folks talk around a grave, careful not to say the word out loud. Ore carts went for decent money. Kegs of blasting powder got snapped up by freighters. Draft horses, ribs showing under winter hair, were bid on like they were the last useful things left in the valley. Nora Prescott didn't bid on any of it. She stood near the back fence with her hands tucked into her coat pockets, hat brim low against the wind. At her heel sat a shaggy gray-brown dog with amber eyes, smoke, quiet as a shadow. People who didn't know her well still knew her name. Widows were easy to remember in a mining town. The Monarch had collapsed the previous spring after a deep, costly dig. Timber supports failed. The lower shaft caved in. No men died, but investors back east didn't care about luck. They cared about margins. They pulled out, sold the machinery, and told everyone to clear out before winter. Most did. When the auctioneer wiped his hands on his vest and called the final lot, a few men chuckled in advance. "One more item," he announced. "Old river mill structure, West Bank, damaged wheel, no operating value, sold as is." The mill had been there before the silver boom, back when Iron Hollow ground grain and cut lumber for ranch valleys instead of pulling ore from rock. Years of neglect and spring floods had warped the foundation. The wheel was split and slumped into the shallows. The roof sagged like a tired back. No one raised a hand. Nora did. $1, she said. A ripple of laughter ran through the yard. "There's no grain left to mill." She bought a ruin. "The miners are leaving, Nora." The auctioneer blinked, then shrugged. "Sold," he said, and dropped his hammer. "To Nora Prescott." Nora didn't argue with the laughter. She walked home with smoke beside her and a folded deed paper in her pocket. She wasn't looking at what Iron Hollow had been. She was looking at what it would need next. Nora's cabin sat where town ended and Willows began. She'd come west from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier as a bride. Her husband, Thomas Prescott, had died under an early Monarch cave-in, one of those accidents everyone called the mountain taking its share. After the funeral, Nora stayed. Some said she couldn't afford to leave. Some said she didn't know when she'd lost. The truth was simpler. Winter didn't care how you felt about it, and Nora had learned not to wait for rescue. Her grandmother, a German woman with thin wrists and iron habits, had raised Nora after fever took her parents. "Heat is like money," she used to say. "Spend it wrong and you go hungry. Spend it right and you live." Nora's father had been a millwright. Water wheels, sluice gates, gears. He treated them like a language. Nora learned by watching his hands and by being the child he didn't shoo away from the workbench. When she came west, she brought one of his notebooks in her trunk. Sketches of wheel paddles, notes on head and flow, careful measurements in ink. Smoke had come later, half-starved near the rail spur, more wolf than dog. She fed him bread. He decided she was his person. Her horse was a bay gelding named Red, sturdy, plain, and sure-footed on ice. Iron Hollow was emptying out, but the river still ran strong, fed by Granite Peak snowfields. The mining roads still cut reliable routes through the hills. Abandoned cabins still stood, broken but repairable. Silver might be gone, but the land wasn't. Water didn't require coal shipments. Water didn't need investors to believe in it. So Nora went to the West Bank and began. The mill looked worse up close. Rot had eaten the lower beams. The wheels' paddles were warped like old shingles. Silt filled the race channel. The dam upstream, stone and log, had been gnawed by years of floods until water spilled through gaps like fingers. Nora stood in river mist and saw what others didn't. Not a ruin, but parts. The drop at the bend was still good, about 4 feet of head over 50 yards. Enough to turn a wheel if the dam held. The main posts were sound where they met stone. The race channel could be cleared. The river was stubborn. Stubborn things were worth building with. She started by repairing the dam. In September, she hauled stones in Red's wagon, pried them into place, and packed clay into seams with her bare hands until her fingers went numb. She cut deadfall logs and lashed them into a new face. Smoke watched from the bank, amber eyes tracking strangers who wandered close. The town watched too. Jonas Wheeler, saloon keeper and loudest mouth on Main Street, leaned on his porch rail. "Widow's building a beaver lodge," he told anyone who'd listen. "Next, she'll charge fish rent." Garrett Hutchkins, once Monarch timber boss, spat into the dust and shook his head. "Water don't care about hope," he said. "That wheel's busted, and winter's coming." Nora didn't answer. Arguing didn't warm a cabin. She worked. She hired 2 boys whose fathers had already left, Eli and Martin, both 15, hungry for wages. She paid them 25 cents a day and fed them stew at noon. She showed them how to set stones so they locked, how to lift with legs, how to keep hands clear of pinch points. "They say you're crazy," Martin muttered one afternoon. Nora tamped clay into a gap. "They said that when Thomas married me," she replied. "He lived with it. I can too." By late October, the dam held enough water to fill the race. Nora measured flow with a weighted string and counted seconds like her father taught her. She built a simple sluice gate from salvaged boards and an iron hinge. When the first ice skimmed the river, she dismantled the wheel and rebuilt it paddle by paddle. Each new plank was planed smooth, 8 inches wide, bolted with iron scavenged from the mine scrap pile. On November 12th, 1887, snow laid a thin skin over the valley. Nora opened the gate. Water rushed into the race channel. The wheel shuddered, groaned, and then, slowly, began to turn. Inside the mill house, the main shaft rotated, vibrating through the boards like a pulse. Nora pressed her palm to the wall and felt motion where there had been only rot. "All right," she whispered. "Now we make you useful." Nora's first lesson at the mill was that waterwork was never done. It was only held day by day against what the river wanted. She learned to read small changes, a new swirl where a stone had shifted, a deeper sound where water found a gap. She began carrying a short stick marked in inches. Every morning she planted it at the same spot below the dam and checked the level, writing it down in Thomas's old account book because it was what she had. September 18th. Water 2 inches below mark. September 25th. Water at mark, dam holding. October 3rd. Level high after rain, east edge leaking. When the east edge leaked, she didn't curse the river. She walked the bank and found where the current pressed hardest. She set larger stones there, not pretty ones but ugly, heavy ones that fit like teeth. She packed willow branches and gravel behind them to slow the seep. Then she tamped clay again, palms raw. Eli asked why she bothered writing the levels down. "You can see it," he said, shrugging. Nora showed him the book. "Seeing is one thing," she told him. "Remembering is another. Winter will make you forget what normal looks like. Paper doesn't." In town, mockery sharpened into sport. Jonas Wheeler started a running joke that Nora would charge admission to watch fish swim through her beaver palace. A pair of men at the general store placed a bet, $5, that her dam would wash out before first snow. Nora heard about it when she bought nails. She set the nails on the counter and slid her coins forward. "Tell them to keep their money," she said. "They'll need it for firewood." The storekeeper, Mrs. Hanley, was a thin woman with a tired face. She watched Nora's hands, cracked knuckles, dirt under the nails. "You want a pry bar?" she asked quietly. "I've got one in back. Better than that shovel." Nora met her eyes. "What do you want for it?" Mrs. Hanley hesitated, then said, "Teach my boy to use it without breaking his foot." So Nora taught another boy, too. That was how it started in Iron Hollow. Not with speeches, but with trades that carried respect in their pockets. The wheel rebuild took longer than Nora wanted. The old hub was split, so she had to make a new one from a single thick timber, 6 inches across at the narrow end, nearly a foot at the wide. She found the timber on an abandoned claim up the canyon, half buried under needles. Red dragged it down on a sled Nora built from scrap runners, and Smoke trotted alongside like a sentry. Nora didn't own a proper plane, so she made do with a draw knife and patience. She shaved the hub smooth, checking roundness with a string looped around it, marking high spots with chalk. She drilled bolt holes by hand, bracing the bit with her knee and turning until her forearms shook. When the first paddle went on, she held it in place while Eli tightened the bolt. "Don't over-torque," she warned, using a word her father had used without knowing he'd given her a future. "You'll split the grain." Eli blinked. "Over what?" Nora almost smiled. "Too tight," she translated. "Wood needs room to breathe." The boys repeated her phrases later like jokes, but they also did what she said. Slowly the wheel took shape. 24 paddles, evenly spaced, each angled to catch water without slapping it away. Nora taught them to listen. A good wheel had a steady sound, thrum, thrum, without a hard smack. When it finally turned under the first skim of ice, Eli's mouth fell open like he'd seen a miracle. Nora didn't call it that. It was just alignment and flow and refusing to quit. Spring of 1888 brought a different test. Snowmelt swelled the river until it ran brown and fast, thick with silt and broken branches. One night in late April, Nora woke to Smoke growling low, a sound he rarely made. The river's roar had changed. It sounded angry. She ran to the bank with a lantern. The dam face foamed under the surge. A log had caught against the spillway and was acting like a lever, pressing sideways. If it shifted, it could pry stones loose. Nora's first impulse was to run back for help, but she saw the town lights dark and distant, and she knew help would be slow. The river was now. She waded into the shallows up to her knees, water numbing her legs through wool. Smoke paced the bank, whining once, an anxious, broken sound. Nora looped a rope around the stuck log and tied the other end to Red's harness. She clucked softly. Red leaned into the pull, hooves digging. The log shifted, scraping stone. For one terrifying second it hung, then broke free and shot downstream like a spear. Water slapped hard against the dam, but the stones held. Nora stumbled back to the bank, teeth clenched against cold. Smoke pressed against her, shaking river water into her skirt. Nora rubbed his head with a wet hand and laughed once, breathless and bitter. "River's always testing," she said. Smoke sneezed, as if agreeing. The next day, Garrett Hutchkins showed up without being asked. He stood on the bank, squinting at the dam. "Heard the river tried you," he said, voice rough. Nora didn't bother denying it. "It did." Garrett kicked a stone with his boot. "You need a log boom," he muttered, as if annoyed by the very idea of learning from her. "Upstream. Catch debris before it hits." Nora watched him. Will you build it? Garrett's jaw worked. Pride fought practicality and lost. Yeah, he said finally. Yeah, I will. That was the first day he stopped being a skeptic and became useful. By summer, the sawmill was steady enough that Nora could think beyond patching roofs. She started keeping accounts on a slate. How many board feet she cut per day, how much water head she needed to keep the blade from bogging, how often she had to grease bearings. Her average day's cut was around 450 board feet when the logs were straight. Less if knots fought her. She learned to set aside the worst boards for crates and the best for walls. Waste was another word for hunger. When settlers began stopping through, they brought news from other valleys. Coal prices rising, freight routes delayed by weather, a boom town 2 ridges over already drying up. Nora listened without comment. Trends didn't matter as much as systems. Still, she adjusted. She built a small storage shed beside the mill and raised it 2 feet off the ground on stone piers to keep spring moisture from rotting the floor. She cut vents under the eaves so air could move through and dry lumber stacks. She showed Eli how to sticker boards, thin spacers between layers, so they wouldn't warp. Eli grumbled at first, then admitted later the boards stayed straighter. Why doesn't anyone else do it? He asked. Nora shrugged. Because doing something right is slower at the start, she said. Most folks quit before it pays. Adding grinding stones meant rethinking the whole interior. A saw wanted speed. Stones wanted steadiness. If the stones ran too fast, they'd heat grain, spoil flour, or throw sparks into dust, an explosion waiting to happen. Nora built a new gear train, a large wooden gear on the main shaft meshing with a smaller pinion, reducing speed. She used oak for the gear teeth because it wore better than pine. She soaked the teeth in boiled linseed oil and let them cure for 3 days, the smell sharp in her cabin. Frank Hutchkins taught her to set iron collars and fit a bearing cup so the stone spindle wouldn't wobble. If it wobbles, he warned, it'll eat itself. Nora nodded. Then it won't wobble. She built the governor last. It was 2 weighted arms mounted on a vertical shaft, swinging outward as speed increased. The faster the stones tried to spin, the more the weights lifted, pulling a linkage that closed the gate slightly. It was simple physics, centrifugal force, though no one in Iron Hollow used those words. Nora called it the rule because it kept the mill honest. She tested it with no grain first, just letting the stones hum. She adjusted the linkage with tiny turns, 1/4 inch at a time, until the sound settled into a low, even purr. Then she poured in barley. The first flour came out coarse, too much bran, so she tightened the stones. The second run came out too hot, so she eased speed and widened the gap. By the 5th run, the flour was pale and fine, warm but not burned. Mrs. Larkin pressed it between her fingers like it was snow. "This is bread," she said, voice thick. "It's grain," Nora corrected gently. Mrs. Larkin looked at her. "No," she insisted. "It's winter, made softer." When the investors arrived in 1889, they expected Iron Hollow to be hungry. They expected a widow to be smaller than their papers. Nora met them with flour on her apron and numbers in her head. "Your offer is generous," Caldwell said, tone suggesting it was charity. "It's convenient," Nora replied. Pruitt's smile sharpened. "Convenient for you, surely." Nora stepped to the ledger shelf and pulled down her account book. She opened it to a page of figures: board sales, flour contracts, repair labor, traded. She didn't hand it over. She just let them see it existed. "I can sell you this mill," she said, "or I can sell you the output of it for 20 years. One of those options keeps Iron Hollow steady. The other makes it dependent again. Caldwell frowned. Dependence is inevitable in business. Nora shook her head. Dependence is a choice people make when they stop building what they need. She pointed toward the riverbank. You want transport rights on these roads. You want supplies without delays. You want a town that can keep your crews fed if you decide to poke at that mountain again. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then you sign my terms? Pruitt's face tightened. And if we don't? Nora's voice stayed calm. Then you ride back to the rail spur and tell your investors the valley isn't ready, and I keep cutting boards while you find another place to gamble. It wasn't bravado. It was truth. And truth was heavier than threats. They signed. In later years, people told the story wrong. They said Nora had saved Iron Hollow with a bold gamble. They said she'd had a vision. They said she'd been blessed with luck. Nora let them talk. She didn't have much interest in being explained. When apprentices asked what had mattered most, money, muscle, timing, she told them the same thing her grandmother had taught her without knowing it was philosophy. Pay attention, Nora said. The land will tell you what it can do. The river will tell you what it can carry. And if you build with what remains, you won't be surprised when the rush ends. Sometimes she'd add, quieter, and share what you learn. Knowledge isn't like gold. Gold gets smaller when you share it. Knowledge gets bigger. Penny, Smoke's descendant, would sit at her boot, amber eyes watching the young faces, as if keeping count of who was listening. The saw blade came from the monarch's leftovers. Most machinery had been sold, but a worn circular blade lay in the scrap pile, ignored. Nora traded potatoes and flour to Frank Hutchkins, the blacksmith, to retemper it. Frank had been Thomas's friend once. Guilt made his eyes dodge hers for years. When he handed her the sharpened blade, sparks still fading from the forge, he cleared his throat. Careful setting it, he said. It'll bite. So will winter, Nora replied. By early December, the mill could cut lumber. It wasn't pretty. Patched tin on the roof, a carriage built from wagon rails, bearings greased with tallow. But when Nora fed the first log into the blade and the wheel drove it through clean and straight, she felt the kind of satisfaction grief couldn't touch. Boards meant walls. Walls meant shelter. She offered lumber cheap, $2 for enough boards to patch a roof, $5 for a full wall's worth. If folks had no cash, she took trade, beans, nails, labor. Some scoffed. No one's staying, Garrett said, like leaving was a virtue. Nora looked at him, calm. Then leave, she answered. But not everyone did. A handful of families couldn't afford to go back east. A few farmers were testing valley soil because land was cheap when silver was gone. Shopkeepers stayed because their lives were nailed into their walls. They bought boards. They tightened cabins against wind. Quietly, Iron Hollow began to change shape, not back into a boom town, but into a place with work. Then winter arrived like a hammer. On January 9th, 1888, the storm came that proved what Nora's wheel could mean. The sky turned the color of old tin. Wind rose before noon. Snow fell sideways, fine as ash, slipping through every crack. By evening, the telegraph went dead. By midnight, the world outside Nora's cabin was a white wall. She slept in her clothes. Smoke lay against the door, red stamped in the lean-to, uneasy. At dawn, Nora cracked the door and felt the cold spear in. The porch, thermometer read -34 degrees Fahrenheit. -34 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold that froze spit before it hit the ground. Cold that made wood snap an iron sting like fire, cold that turned pride brittle. Nora harnessed red anyway, smoke pressed close, fur already frosted. The path to the river was nearly gone, but Nora followed willows by memory. At the mill, snow banked against the wheel shelter. Ice had thickened in the race channel despite the straw she'd packed around it. The wheel was turning but slow, paddles slipping. If the wheel seized, the mill would die. If the mill died, so would her trade, and any chance of keeping others sheltered with lumber and flour. Nora chipped ice with a hammer until her arms shook. She cleared the gate and opened it wider to force more flow. Water resisted, thick as syrup, but it moved. The wheel shuddered, caught, and began turning with more authority. Motion is warmth, Nora breathed, more mantra than wisdom. She turned to head back and heard shouting carried by, "Wind!" Jonas Wheeler staggered down the bank, hat gone, face raw red. Behind him came two men supporting a third who couldn't walk. "Nora!" Jonas yelled. "The McCready cabin! Roof caved! Snow's coming in! Two little ones! They'll freeze!" Nora didn't ask why Jonas had come to her. She didn't ask why McCready had stayed. Winter didn't care about explanations. "Bring them here," Nora shouted. "Bring the family to the mill house. It's tighter than their cabin." Jonas stared. "To the mill?" "It's got walls," Nora snapped. "Move!" The men dragged the injured man, Tom McCready, into the mill house, out of the wind. Nora lit a lantern and hung it from a beam. Smoke came in last and sat beside Tom, amber eyes steady, as if lending calm by sheer presence. Frank Hutchkins pulled off his gloves with shaking hands. "Tom fell through his porch," he said. "Ankle's bad. Cabin's giving." Nora looked at Tom McCready, once loud about silver, now pale with fear, and felt no satisfaction, only urgency. She turned to Garrett Hutchkins, who stood there breathing hard, pride stripped by cold. "Help me clear the saw carriage," she ordered. "We cut boards now." Garrett stared at the storm outside, then back at her. "In this?" Nora met his gaze. "Unless you'd like to nail snow to their roof." Garrett swallowed and nodded. "All right," he rasped. "Tell me." For hours the mill became a factory of survival. Nora fed logs into the blade, hands steady. Garrett and Frank hauled fresh boards inside so they wouldn't frost crack. Jonas and Eli carried lumber through the storm to the McCready cabin, where men nailed it over the caved section with numb fingers. The wheel turned. The dam held. The river, stubborn beneath ice, did what it had always done, kept moving. Near dusk, Jonas paused, trying to splint Tom's ankle with a board and cloth. His voice shook. "We laughed at you." He admitted. "I did. Said you'd lost your sense." Nora didn't stop working. "Save the apology," she said. "Use your hands first." By nightfall, the McCready roof was patched enough to keep snow out. The family was moved to Jonas's saloon, where a stove still burned. Tom's ankle was set as best Frank could manage. The storm raged on, but the immediate death, cold rushing into a broken roof, had been pushed back by boards cut from a wheel no one wanted. When Nora finally shut the gate, she packed extra straw around the race and checked braces by lantern light. Her arms trembled with exhaustion. Smoke pressed against her leg, solid warmth. In the quiet between gusts, Nora understood what she'd bought at the auction. Not a ruin. A heartbeat. After that winter, Iron Hollow's skepticism didn't disappear, but it softened into something more useful. Respect. Garrett started showing up with wagon loads of rock for the dam face, gruffly pretending. He'd had the idea first. Frank sent iron bolts and scraps without charging. Jonas began telling every freighter and settler who passed through that iron hollow could supply lumber without waiting on coal shipments. And then the farmers came. The valley soil, ignored during the boom, proved better than people thought. Mrs. Larkin brought Nora a sack of barley and flexed her swollen wrists. "I can't grind it by hand no more," she said. "If you can, if the mill can." "The wheel can drive more than a saw," Nora answered. Adding stones meant new gearing, slower, steadier, with control. Nora rebuilt the interior shafts through spring of 1888, cutting wooden cogs from salvaged oak, fitting each tooth with careful patience. She built a simple governor with weighted arms, copying a sketch from her father's notebook and adjusting it by ear until the mill's hum settled into a reliable rhythm. In June, matched granite stones arrived from the rail spur, 4 feet across, 8 inches thick, nearly a ton apiece. They cost $65, money Nora had saved board by board, sack by sack. Half the town came to watch them roll into place. When Nora opened the gate and the stones began to turn, grain poured between them and emerged as flour, warm from friction. Mrs. Larkin exhaled a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You did it," she whispered. Nora brushed flour from her hands. "The river did." Mrs. Larkin shook her head. "The river's always been here," she said. "You're the one who listened." That summer, Iron Hollow became something unexpected, a supply point instead of a mine camp. Lumber for rebuilding, flour for settlers pushing farther west. Water-powered machinery that didn't depend on coal or investor moods. When the next winter came, fewer cabins stood empty. In September of 1889, 2 men in clean coats rode into town from the rail spur. Soft hands, polished boots. They introduced themselves as Mr. Caldwell and Mr. Pruitt, representatives of investors reconsidering the valley. They found Nora at the mill with flour dust on her apron. "We'd like to make an offer," Pruitt said smoothly. "To purchase the mill operation. Cash, of course. You could start fresh somewhere else." Nora looked past them to the wheel turning under ice-cold spray. Smoke lay by the door, muzzle graying now. Red grazed on the bank, patient. "No," Nora said. Caldwell frowned. "Miss Prescott, you may not understand." "I understand," Nora replied. "You want what works. You always do, once it's proven." Pruitt's smile tightened. "Name your price." "I'm not selling," Nora said, "but I will negotiate contracts." They blinked, unprepared for a widow who understood leverage. Nora offered supply agreements, transport rights on the mining roads, long-term usage shares if new operations came in. She insisted on clauses that protected the riverbank from reckless digging and required road maintenance for any freight traffic. The men went away stiff-backed. A week later, they returned with papers. Nora read every line. She changed what didn't serve the town. She made them sign anyway. Iron Hollow never returned to a silver rush. The monarch stayed quiet. But the town endured, small, stubborn, working. People began to say Nora had been lucky. Nora never corrected them. Luck was what some men called it when they saw a woman succeed without their permission. Epilogue. 22 years later. In the winter of 1910, Iron Hollow was still cold, still isolated, still carved into the valley like a choice someone had to keep making. But it was no longer empty. A schoolhouse stood where empty cabins once sagged. A modest depot loaded flour and boards bound farther west. The main street stayed dusty in summer and buried in snow in January, but buildings were solid, lumber cut by Nora's wheel, nails forged by Frank Hutchkins, stone set by hands that had learned steadiness. Nora Prescott was 49, hair threaded with silver that made her smile at the irony. Her hands were still calloused, her back ached on cold mornings, but her posture remained straight, built by years of refusing to fold. Smoke had died of old age years before, buried under a cottonwood above the mill. Beside Nora now trotted a descendant, shaggy, gray-brown, amber-eyed, named Penny. Red was gone too, but his grandson stood in the yard, a bay gelding as practical as the first. The thermometer on the millhouse wall read -29 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, the wheel turned in a rhythm so familiar it felt like breathing. Grinding stones hummed. Sacks of grain waited in a neat line, each marked with a farm name that didn't exist when Nora bought a ruin for $1. A group of apprentices, young men and women from down valley towns, stood near the gearing, listening. Nora taught them because she believed what her grandmother had believed. Knowledge wasn't like gold. Gold got smaller when you shared it. Knowledge got bigger. One girl with strong arms asked, "Is it true nobody wanted this mill?" Nora's mouth curved. "They wanted it," she said. "They wanted it once it worked." "Why'd you buy it when it was ruin?" the girl pressed. Nora looked out through the slats at the river moving under ice. She thought of Thomas's laugh before the mine took him, her father's careful ink sketches, Smoke's silent loyalty at her heel in the worst storm of her life. She answered simply, "Because when the rush ends, the river remains." Behind her, Garrett Hutchkins, old now, leaning on a cane, cleared his throat. "I called you crazy," he said, voice rough with age. "I was wrong." Nora didn't gloat. She nodded once. "Most folks are wrong before they're right," she replied. "Cold teaches faster than words." Garrett gave a short laugh. "It sure does." After the apprentices went home and the last sack was loaded, Nora walked up to the cottonwood above the mill. Penny followed, paws quiet in snow. She brushed frost from Smoke's worn stone marker and stood listening. Wheel creak, river murmur, the steady sound of something that didn't care about silver prices or investor telegrams. Warmth was precious on the frontier. So was purpose. Nora had built both, not by arguing, but by working. The valley wind cut sharp, but inside the mill house there was motion, and motion meant warmth. Iron Hollow hadn't been saved by luck. It had been saved by the one thing that stayed after the rush ended: the river.